So thank you, everybody. I have shared with half the world my technical inabilities and limitations, and thank you for your patience. I thought to begin this presentation with a paragraph from Pope Benedict XVI in a document called Caritas in Veritate, charity and truth, in truth. And he says in that something very powerful, a very powerful insight into how advocacy could look. He says, as we contemplate the vast amount of work to be done, we are sustained by our faith that God is present alongside those who come together in God's name to work for justice. A joyful task to be accomplished in a spirit of solidarity. My reading of that paragraph is that we really highlight some of the critical aspects of what we as a faith community bring to the world of advocacy, and bring to the world of advocacy especially around migrants, refugees, displaced persons, internally displaced persons, persons whom we often think of and call mobile people.
Peter John, if I can just remind you, please, to slow down quite considerably for Micheline.
Oh, that was my slow.
No, slower than that.
Slower than that. So we have 3 or 4 things that we need to look at in this. The one is, it is a contemplative task. The advocacy that the church brings is a contemplative task. It's not purely ideological. It comes from the stirring and the reflections of the heart. It is conscious of the vast amount of work to be done. It is conscious of the fact that it is a gospel orientation. We come to it because the gospel demands it. It's not perhaps if we wired up like that, if we like that kind of work, it is a demand of the gospel. If we're not doing work for justice, we are not fulfilling our gospel mandate. It's a question of doing it with others. The task is huge. We can't do it on our own. We don't have all the skills. We don't have the all the intellectual angles. We don't have all the experiences. It's something we do together. It is about justice. Those who work for justice is the Pope. It is not a work of charity. St. Augustine says that charity is no substitute for justice without it. And it's done in a spirit of theology of solidarity. And that's quite an important point. We have what is often called in theology a communitarian dimension. It is, we don't see things for how it affects us as an individual in the first place. We see it through the lens of how this affects the community, the common good. So we have solidarity as what is sometimes called in theology the thick understanding, the understanding that allows us to say, we do this, but we do it not in the first place from an individual situation, but an individual benefit, individual expediency, but we do it to see how we can best strengthen the common good, best strengthen the community. So it's a gospel mandate. It's a work of faith. We can't escape it, otherwise we escape faith. It's a work that is done with others in partnership, and it's about justice, and it's about solidarity. So, oops. It's interesting, I think, if we look at the world of advocacy, the world of public life, what is happening on the public stage, there's a profound sense that God is back. There's a very interesting book by John Micklewith and Adrian Woodridge called exactly that, God is back. I think historically, after a period where science and a number of biases came together to exclude religion from the public space, it is now time where religion is very openly part of the public space. Religion has emerged strongly, sometimes in an extreme form, but more we are encouraged in a responsible form of engagement for the common good. That means, I believe, that three key challenges right at the beginning of looking at advocacy in the faith-based world emerges. Firstly, there's the challenge to bring our policies, our politics, in line with the tenets of our belief. The theologian David Tracy said well, he says, what we are tasked to do is to give public expression to our privately held beliefs. We have privately held beliefs, and how do we translate those beliefs into public expressions? How do we allow our understanding, for instance, of the Holy Trinity, so central to the Christian faith, to translate into advocacy for migrants and refugees?
Peter John, can I just interrupt you quickly? Sorry.
Yeah.
A message from the interpreter, Micheline, asking those who are listening on the French channel to not make noise, because she is struggling to hear the speaker when there is noise coming in on the French channel. So all of those on the French channel, please remember to keep muted and not to make any noise. Thank you. So that should be okay, Peter John, if you want to carry on.
Thank you. Thank you. And the third point I want to make is we need to develop our competencies so that we contribute to public discussion professionally. It is not enough to go into public domains and say, the Bible says, or the Pope says, or any religious text says. We've got to be able to develop our competencies so that we engage professionally. So the God is back scenario, I believe, raises those three challenges: to bring our policies in line with our beliefs, to articulate a public expression to our privately held beliefs, and to develop our competencies so that we engage professionally. There's a lovely quote that at the bottom of this slide that is from Cardinal Bernardin, who says and speaks to the interconnectedness of all of this in our work for advocacy. Let me just read it once. You can go back to look at it again, it is a very powerful quote. He says, "I'm convinced that the Catholic moral tradition has the scope, the strength, and the subtlety to address the wide range of issues effectively. The vision joins the humanity of the unborn infant and the humanity of the hungry. It calls for positive legal action to prevent killing the unborn or the aged, and positive societal action to provide shelter for the homeless and education for the illiterate." So the public space that religion is called to speak into is one that is holistic. Pope Francis has spoken in his encyclical Gaudete Exsultate of not the danger of prioritizing one set of rights over the other, and the importance of seeing it holistically. It's generally understood in the religious domain that there are four models of advocacy, or four strands of advocacy that inform us. We know from the story of the Exodus that to stand with prayer and intercession is one way of speaking truth to power. We know that a key part, and many of the people on this call are very active in this domain, is that we have a responsibility to educate the minds and the hearts of people so that what they believe and what they hold in their hearts trickles down into the kinds of actions they perform. What we believe determines how we act, and we have a responsibility to act in ways that are to educate the mind and heart so that our actions can be pro-poor, pro-justice, pro-life in the fullness of that term. Thirdly, we are reminded that we are called to a world of activism and direct action. Prophetic witness, if you like, at the barricades. Prophetic activity that brings into the public space the issues that we are advocating for. The history of so many countries in the 20th century was formed by this kind of direct action. Our own country, South Africa, much of the change resulted from direct action. India, just the other day, Indian history remembered the beginning of the Salt March. Thousands of people marching to the beach. The history of the Philippines. So many places where direct action forced political change. And then the area that we're concerned about, legislation and policy. Then to be engaged at the points of influence, to exercise leverage at those places where decisions are made. The scriptures, which is our foundational text, have all four examples, and all four examples flow into each other. Good activism has to have an outcome, either in education or in legislation and legislative engagement. Prayer needs to lead to good activism. So they're not separated. It just depends on where we locate it to highlight the particular aspect that we are engaged in. They belong together, but each of us has a particular emphasis. The words of John Paul II, I often go back to, where he says, what is needed is a different approach rather than just different strategies and policies. Fundamentally, it requires another vision of what is valuable, another perception of what is possible, another recognition of what is required. That's very key. That gives a very powerful framework, especially the framework of the imagination, how we think, how we imagine the work we do. That gives a very helpful framework for that imagination. There are also three key values in faith-based advocacy and three key principles which act as benchmarks for assessing policies. The values that prompt us into the kinds of work for justice and the kinds of work for advocacy are three things that in 1985, the Vatican Commission for Theology gave as indications for the kinds of work that advocacy should ensure. It says it is geared towards ensuring participation. It ensures that policies speak to equality and to freedom. The principles are solidarity, which I've already spoken to, subsidiarity, which is about making decisions at the level at which those and by the people most affected by them, and responsibility, which is our engagement with the common good. We have a responsibility for that. I will come back to some of that later. The American sociologist Bernstein, who writes quite a lot around advocacy and around creating the space for public engagement, he says, and I really think we need to carry these the sentiment in our hearts because it's put so very well. He says we need to create those types of spaces in which people come together and debate, in which they can encounter each other in formation, clarification, and the testing of opinions, where judgment, deliberation, and pronesis, that Greek word for community wisdom, can flourish. So when we look at what we want to do especially in the policy dimension, we are saying we want to take that insight of Pope Benedict. We want to look at the challenge of what religion means today in the public space and how we act responsibly in that regard. And we want to say, how do we take those principles and values, subsidiarity, solidarity, the values of participation and equality, and how do we begin to shape them in such a way that they can engage the public space? And Bernstein says, we create those kinds of spaces through our advocacy in which people can come together and debate, can encounter each other in the process of formation, the formation of the mind and the heart, in which they can clarify their ideas, which they can test opinions and see if they really hold, where judgment, deliberation, and community wisdom can really flourish. The theologian Marty says that public theology, because this is the kind of theology we're doing theology in the public face. We're doing theology to broaden the understanding and the ideas that the public holds so that their actions can bring about change. And Martin Marty says, public theology seeks to address issues of society, politics, and culture theologically, from that contemplation that Pope Benedict spoke about, and to articulate this theology in a manner accessible to the wider population, so as to avoid the sectarianism, i.e., the withdrawal of Christians from public discourse into the discourse of separated and small communities. I would ask you to go back to the slide as well when you receive them, because what Professor Marty is pointing out is saying that we have a whole toolbox, a toolkit, which we can bring to our work of advocacy, and that will prevent us from withdrawing into small silos of just churchiness. We have a responsibility to change the world, to change perceptions, to change legislation, and we don't do that by becoming enmeshed in our small silos. Interestingly, Pope Benedict, at the end of the second Synod on Africa, he said we must prevent withdrawal or evasion present in a theological and spiritual speculation, which would serve as an escape from concrete historical responsibility. So there is a theological understanding that we are most active and carrying out and being most responsible when we, not when we are speculating in our own mind, but when we engage in the historical processes that allow for an understanding and clarification of what's going on around us and of how we can respond to what's going on around us. That word responsibility emerges very often. And very often, well, in this country in particular, people say, well, I'm not guilty. I don't have to do anything about it. And I remind you, just in passing, of the words of Abraham Heschel, where he says, some are guilty, but all are responsible. We all have the responsibility to make and to bring about change. Traditionally, the church has tried to bring about change through moral formation of those in leadership. And in a way, those of us who work in the parliamentary space are still doing that. But many people have observed that this has limitations. Those who benefit are likely to seek ways of continuing to benefit. Mary Hobgood, a theologian, says that the privilege of the elites can only be limited by organized, imaginative counterpower. Social justice will not come through the gifts by those who control power, but when the marginalized mobilize to exercise their own self-empowerment. And so one of the shifts in theology, and one of the expressions of the God is back in the public domain, is that the faith community and the church in particular sees change not only exclusively as coming from the top, from those who are in high office, from those who have access to the levers of power, but that change and advocacy, and if you like, the ferment in the public space has to also happen amongst those who are most affected. The marginalized must mobilize to exercise their own self-empowerment. And policy change is geared to both places. Those who have power and those who should benefit from that power. I'll skip the next. So three, but just let me perhaps also remind us of a important insight by the community activist Saul Zelinsky. He says, when we speak about citizenship, about people, in other words, exercising their rights and developing their agency, we talk and think in terms of an informed, active, participating, interested people. Advocacy must speak deeply into creating those kinds of engaged, active citizens. And he makes the point, a people can only participate if they have the opportunity to formulate their own program. Some of the commentators who follow the ministry of Pope Francis have noted how certain words crop up in all his talks and speeches. And they are words such as dialogue, listening, encounter, bridges, integration, peace. And just recalling what Father Avellino said to us at the beginning, those kinds of words also shape the particular brand of advocacy that the faith community brings to the broader advocacy project. Three concepts just to hold in mind, and I've mentioned them in the before. Our work is public. I've spoken about public platforms and public engagement and public theology. In the advocacy which we are doing all across the continent, which all of us are involved in different ways, is public. It seeks to affect the public space and how people live together communally. At the theological level, and the word is not one that everybody uses in everyday conversation, but we say, and I just ask you to note it, that theology in the public space is not so much apologetic, but hermeneutical. And what do I mean by that? Apologetic theology says, how can I make my 4 teenage children understand their faith better? And so I work on a way of getting people to understand what they believe in a way that is helpful to their own mind. That's, broadly speaking, apologetics. Trying to give an understanding of something so that people understand the faith better. Hermeneutics is the lens through which we look at things so that we can get a desired result. And so what we understand in the faith community as hermeneutical is we say, how do we take our faith and how does our faith allow us to better bring about a result in the public space. So how does my belief in something like the Holy Trinity or the communion of saints, how does that help me to bring about a more just situation for migrants? And so I have to say to myself, well, Holy Trinity is about equality. 3 persons equal. 3 persons doing specific things to bring about a culture of love. So what does that mean in real terms? And we can go on with all our other concepts that underline our faith. And then, as I said before, it is a communitarian vision. Our theological bias is never only towards the individual, it's towards the individual in the community. So we always look and ask what works for the common good rather than what suits an individual. And you can see already in that how the politics and the ideological perspective of our advocacy is not so much towards all the social pathologies we see around us now, self-enrichment, corruption, all of those things that speak to a person's singular interest, individual interest, rather than an interest in the common good. There are 2 slides that I don't want to go into now, but they speak to how we need to encourage people to participate. They are from official documents of the Catholic of participation, how we need to allow formation of people to move them in such a way that they are able to participate in the formation of their own society and their own future, how it can bring about greater dignity and how they can act in accordance with their conscience. I leave that to you. They both.
Sorry, we've lost your screen. You're not sharing screen anymore. I think you might have pushed a button somewhere.
When did you lose my?
Just with that the last slide, which you said spoke to 2 church documents. It was a Gaudium et Spes quote.
Yeah, Gaudium et Spes number 75.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was the one before that.
Just go back to your
Kenny
share.
around to help me find it again. I don't see any of the icons coming.
Just hover your cursor over the bottom of your screen and you'll find your share screen button will come up.
No, it's not. That's my problem. I was doing that. It's not coming up. It's not even coming up at the top where it had been for a while.
Have you?
I don't know what I could have pressed that would have.
If you go to the top of your screen, you should have something that indicates what sort of view you're in.
Yeah, nothing is coming up. I mean, they had been all the time. I've been seeing them floating in and out, but I don't see them now.
If you go to the top right of your screen, there should be something that tells you about full screen or exiting.
Nothing. There's no. But let me just see. No. Let me. When I click on any place, it just moves the pictures that I see in front of me. I'm not winning anywhere.
Okay.
Nothing is coming. No anything. Not audio. Not video. Not any chat or participants or any of those things that were there all the time.
PJ?
Yeah,
PJ, can you hear me?
I can very well.
Hi, PJ.
Yeah,
I can't hear any of you.
I can hear you, Kenny.
Just look right at the bottom perhaps of your screen. Just see if you can see the Zoom meeting icon.
No.
I can't hear PJ.
The little blue and white camera icon right at the bottom of your screen.
No. Nothing's there.
No, there should be one. You must have pressed something that. Can you maybe, Mike, can I suggest that it was the last slide? Maybe PJ might just continue speaking to the slide without actually showing the slide, because you're going to waste time now. I'm not quite sure what exactly PJ can see on his screen.
I can see I can see the slide.
You can see the slide. I think that is why you are in your shared screen. Yeah, you're in a shared screen, so you can only see that. Why don't you just exit that can you close your presentation completely? Minimize the screen that you have there, and just exit can you exit your presentation?
Not really. I can minimize it, and I've got it minimized now, but all of the slides are coming in a no, it's just continually.
Okay. So what we will try to do is, Megan has got your presentation.
Yeah.
So Megan, if you can put it up on your screen.
Yes.
Okay, so you share your screen with Peter John's presentation, and he can just talk to that.
Okay. 1 second.
Sorry, everybody, this is the kind of thing that does happen. So here we go. Everybody should be.
Sorry, everybody.
So Peter John, are you seeing this now? You seeing your slide?
I'm seeing my slide, yes.
Okay, so you just need to tell Megan whether she needs to go forward or back with the slides, and then you speak to them as normal.
Okay, Megan, 2 slides hence where it says categories in public discourse.
This is the one, Peter John, where we lost your presentation. This was the one that was showing.
No, yeah, there should, the one where I think you lost me is Gaudium et Spes, paragraph 75.
Yes.
Okay, I'm not going to. I'm going to skip that one and just ask people to read it.
Okay, Megan, I think you're going the wrong way. You need to be going the other way.
Sorry, it's a bit slow.
Okay, Peter John,
the slide after that says forming conscience for faithful citizenship, which we're going to leave.
Oopsie, sorry. Is this where you want to be, Peter John?
And I want to go to the next one that says Gustafsson lists the categories.
Okay, we had Gustafsson.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Do you have that on the screen now?
No.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
Gustafsson.
Okay.
Yes, you can go ahead.
Thank you. So, in advocacy in the public in the faith domain, we often speak about 4 types of advocacy, 4 categories of advocacy that follow the Bible's kind of advocacy. When you do a deep study of advocacy in the Bible, there are 4 types of 4 categories of advocacy that emerge. And my suggestion this morning, the suggestion of many who write in this area and think about this, is that we always have to, that we are advised to use one of the categories depending on what kind of advocacy we're doing. So for instance, there's prophetic advocacy, where you are on the barricades, where you're making demands, where you're speaking with the righteous anger and indignation of a prophet, saying, "Thus says the Lord, let justice flow like the rivers." But sometimes the advocacy is a narrative advocacy. Sometimes through the telling and the sharing of stories, we make profound public points. Sometimes it is technical. For many of us, when we do submissions, we are quite technical in how we write up a submission to Parliament on a particular aspect. Sometimes it's a policy mode where we are developing ideas to take forward, maybe complementary to the ideas, or often in opposition to the ideas, but it's about a policy. So Gustafsson says that when the faith community does advocacy, we always have to look at what the situation is, what we want to achieve, and what category is most appropriate for that kind of advocacy. So prophetic, narrative, technical, and policy. And we have to always ask which is the best. Megan, can we go to the next slide, please? And it should have a little girl in the marketplace on it. Are we there?
Yes, we are.
Okay. So from that thought, many working in advocacy have also pointed out a few other considerations to bear in mind. Firstly, that when we work in the faith community, and especially when we are also working in legislative spaces, whether it be at local level, at regional level, or at national level, we specifically work through institutions. And so we have to shape our advocacy in such a way that it speaks to processes that the institution holds to help it reach a decision. So we can't bring into an institution the kind of advocacy that, say, has no respect for rules. When we choose to work in an institution, there are some limitations, but also some possibilities that we have to abide by. Secondly, it's relational. We build relationships, and those relationships, the trust that emerges in relationship, that becomes a very powerful base for common action. Thirdly, it's broad-based. Most of even our specific contributions emerge from a broader understanding of issues. So even when we are making a specific recommendation in terms of migrants or refugees, it comes from a broader understanding that everyone, irrespective of their status, has a common dignity which has to be valued and enhanced above everything else. And finally, it's non-partisan. We don't go into the public space in order to fly the flag for a particular party. It's non-partisan, but it's intensely political. It engages political processes, political discussions without being partisan. If we could go to the next slide, please. And maybe leave the next slide and go to a slide that has a woman with a baby on the back.
There we are.
Thank you. And so people often speak of 3 A's in public advocacy, in the public domain. We speak about, and I've alluded to it several times, about agency. Part of what we are called to do is to develop the capacity of people to speak for themselves, to envision what they want, how they want to do it, and what's appropriate for them. So we part of advocacy in the public space is to develop the agency of people, the capacities of people to do things for themselves. The second A is assets, because part of what really happens in advocacy is that communities bring to advocacy what they already have. They bring assets. It might not be material assets, but they bring wisdom. They bring an understanding of the area. They bring an understanding of other people, of their culture. And they bring all of that, and that becomes and has to become part of the advocacy we do. And there is a spirit of appreciation. So appreciation says that everybody has something positive to contribute. And I think when designing advocacy engagement, when looking at how best to take those categories of Gustafson and begin to use them creatively and justly in the public space, we also keep these 3 A's in mind: agency, assets, and appreciation. And then Megan, if we could go to the very last slide so that we have some time for discussion. Just want to, I've skipped a few slides which I hope you will look at. and ponder. But I just want to go to the last slide, just to, as a word of encouragement, the words from Robert F. Kennedy, which he spoke in 1965 at the University of Cape Town, just a kilometer or two from where I'm sitting now. And I think he captured a spirit which we need to capture in our own work for advocacy, which can so often be so disheartening, which seems to offer no results and demands much labor. He says, few will have the greatness to bend history itself, but each of us can work to change a small portion of events. And in the total of those acts will be written the history of this generation. It is from numberless diverse acts of courage and belief that human history is changed. Each time a person stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he or she sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring. Those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. If Athens appears to you great, consider then that her glories were purchased by valiant people, people who learned their duty. Those great elements of faith-based advocacy, of engagement in the public space, also changes history and gives to us the responsibility to make those changes happen. So I'm going to leave it there and allow for, we have about roughly 20 minutes, I think, to engage in some conversation. There are more slides in the package you will get, but I realize that my technical ineptitude has prevented this great flow of them. So just bear with me and read the slides when you have an opportunity. That's it, Mike.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I think we all managed to follow that fairly well. There is already one question.
I can't see the chat box, so I can't see anything other than my slide. So you're going to have to help me through this.
Okay. The first question is around your personal experiences in this kind of advocacy work, and whether or not, according to those experiences, the advocacy has worked. So I was thinking, you mentioned the different categories, the narrative and the prophetic and so on. If you can relate that to the kind of advocacy work that you've been involved in, for example, with the Ministry of Home Affairs around, the regulations and the stipulations of which refugees need which permits, and how that has changed over the years. If you can talk about that experience of making a practical difference, according to the kind of categories of advocacy that you mentioned.
Sure. I think one of the questions that we all ask ourselves all the time, especially in a world that yearns for quick fixes and wants to see things happen and wants to have change happen quickly, is that anybody engaging in advocacy has to have different timelines. Things take long in the public domain. They take long because there are processes. It's part of what I said about institutional, if you work in an institutional environment, you work with processes, you work with timelines that, for instance, commit one to engagement with others, to hearing the voice of others, to public participation, and so forth. So our timelines are very different, and therefore, just as a kind of opening remark, to say it's often difficult to say if things, in the short term, to say if things have been successful or not, because advocacy demands a long-term view. I think part of what Mike's asking me to comment on is the fact that it does work to have conversations and to bring experiences, but also to offer technical possibilities to those who have the levers of power. And a few people on this call would have had the experience over the past few, over the past year and a half, for instance, of engagements with the Department of Home Affairs at different levels to gain certain clarifications around what the law allows. People in power often obscure a reading of the law that allows for maximum benefit and for the sharing of resources, and give it a narrow, limited reading. Now, in several instances, particularly around the provision of education for undocumented children, for instance, that has been challenged. There is a reading of our constitution in South Africa that says education is the right of every child. It says nothing about status, but bureaucrats have inserted limitations to that process. To reverse that, a number of organizations had come together to engage the Department of Education, the Department of Home Affairs, courts, around different ways of turning that around. And that's a little bit of what I said at the beginning. Each of us knows where our strengths best qualify us to engage. Some of our colleagues, and there's some on this call, engaged at the level of building the capacity of the people involved so that they could speak for themselves, that they could deliver testimonies, that they could tell their stories. Some of us worked with engaging the minister because we have perhaps a bit more political access. Others took the matter to the courts. So each of us found a way in which our strengths and our skills could be best used for a common cause and turn that situation around. The situation has changed, but it's advocacy of many people in partnership speaking to their strengths. We've seen that in recent times during the lockdown, where we've managed to get a somewhat more generous reading of regulations turned around. So what it means is that those areas that Gustafsson speaks about need to be interrogated quite seriously. We need to look at it and say, this organization, remember I said at the beginning that in the faith-based community, partnerships, and in civil society, partnerships are very important. And so we look and we say, where are our skills best suited to make a change? An office like CPLO has the possibility of exploring Parliament and people in Parliament and people in the institution. We use that avenue, but we work alongside people who are using other avenues all for the common good. So success is not instant, and therefore, let me just say again, you've got to have a different timeline. Advocacy is a long-term project. It seldom changes overnight. It's a partnership, and you've got to use your skills. If you're going to get good results, you've got to work with others. But I spoke earlier of sharpening our competencies, and that is something that allows us to use the situation we in and to enhance it and to get a better result. So my answer is yes, it does work, it can work, it often works, but don't hope for a quick and easy solution.
Okay, there is a second question, which to some extent you have perhaps answered, but nevertheless, you might want to expand on a bit. The question is about what advice you would give to those who find that the advocacy that they are doing through representations to Parliament in particular is falling on deaf ears and doesn't seem to be making a big difference. I suppose, is there a difference between kind of advocacy that you conduct to Parliament and to legislators, perhaps as opposed to dealing directly with a government minister or with officials and bureaucrats and so on? Does it call for a different approach?
I think it calls for the same approach with perhaps different emphases. I think, you know, one of the things that I think anybody who has had a long spell, as Mike and I have had, in advocacy knows well is that there are seasons. It's a bit like the Bible, the book of Ecclesiastes. For everything, there is a season. And there are some seasons when it is more difficult to speak to those in power than in other seasons. But I think the reminder I want to underline is that when one speaks, for instance, to Parliament, and this is possibly a difference, one speaks to Parliament, but one is also in the public space. So when you speak to Parliament, when we make a presentation to Parliament, and Mike will speak about this tomorrow, we are not only speaking to members of Parliament, but we are speaking to a much broader group of people who've also come to make representations. We're speaking in ways that the media might pick up. We are also taking our insights into, say, the Catholic media. And so speaking to Parliament is not just about the 20 people who might be on that committee. It's speaking to that committee and the whole range of people around it. There's a South African academic called Tom Lodge who says quite insightfully that what happens around Parliament is often as important as what happens in Parliament. So the engagement in Parliament has ripple effects on other people who also work in that space. And in that way, the footprint of those things that Bernstein speaks about, clarification, formation, and so forth, is expanded. So, so I think that even when the legislators or the parliamentarians or a particular minister isn't reacting favorably, the work of advocacy and the work of expanding the footprint continues, and that will bring its results in due course. You know, there are times when one wants to and needs to respect a confidence, and so one doesn't go out and say, well, the minister made this promise, but there are also times when we can extrapolate the promises made and he or she's made and hold them accountable to it. So there's a slight difference, but I think the point I want to make is that the disheartening seasons that are there are not without their silver lining, because the process of advocacy is expanded, even if it's not being responded to by the people who are the principal beneficiaries. It has a ripple effect.
Okay, there's another question. I think this one invites you just to go back a little bit and recap what you were saying about the particular Catholic social teaching principles that are applicable. The question is, from a doctrinal point of view, is the principle of solidarity, that is from a CST point of view, is the principle of solidarity the main one applicable to work with migrants? And if there are other CST principles applicable, which are they?
Thank you. I think a close reading of the magisterium, or the teaching office of Pope Francis, is certainly giving a lot more emphasis to the notion of solidarity. That human beings, because they are human beings, and because they belong to each other and are part of the human race, irrespective of status, have a dignity, and that dignity comes with rights, comes with responsibilities too, but it comes with rights. And I think a reading of the statements that have been made around refugees and migrants in recent times points to that core of solidarity as the principle that holds all the other work together. So my sense is, and I think more than my sense, I think it's an accepted sense now, that solidarity is the key Catholic social teaching principle that is used to help us understand the dignity of those mobile people, but also how and what we give emphasis to in our work. What are the other, all the other Catholic social teaching principles come into play? For instance, one of those principles that hardly ever spoken about is the universal destination of goods, which holds, and it's a teaching of the Church, that the private appropriation of goods can only happen when once everybody has a basic access to goods and is able to meet their basic needs. Many people have been looking at it recently in this country in terms of the very robust debate around land. But in the world of refugees, and in the world of migrants, and in the world of asylum seekers and people who cross from one country to another in search of basic possibilities to ward off starvation, to care for families, to provide for the most indigent part of their families, there is a deep sense that the earth belongs to those who live in it, and that there's an equality that needs to pertain to the goods of the earth. And therefore one can begin to work that into a position that one takes, for instance, with regard to asylum seekers. Is it, if I have nothing in a neighboring country and it's going through turmoil or so, do I have the right to go and to where there is a bit more to offer? And I think we would say yes. So there are a number of, so all the principles, it's one of the important things about Catholic social teaching is that the principles, some people speak of 10 principles, some people speak of a dozen, but whatever number we give to it, they always work together. They work coherently. One might take center stage for a particular time and a particular issue, but the others all serve in an interlinked way to strengthen that. So there's that. You know, subsidiarity would be another. To empower people to make decisions where they are. You can easily translate that into the many difficult situations around migrants and refugees. So I think solidarity is, but certainly the other principles, human dignity, you know, the access to human rights, the subsidiarity, universal destination of goods, all of these things are strong supports. They like scaffolding around the building. They give support and help us to build up.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments that anybody would like to contribute? There's nothing further in the chat box, so I'm just going to give it a minute or two, just in case there is anything further. We have now been together for 2 hours, which is quite a long time. We will not prolong this first session any more than it needs to be. And I remind you that during the course of the week, we will traverse some of this ground again in our other sessions. This has just been the first of 5 main sessions. But if you do have any further questions or comments, please put them in the chat box. Everybody can follow them there. And while we wait for that, our next session will be this afternoon, when we listen to some country profiles, as I put it in the email that I sent to everybody. Part of the purpose of this week is for all of us to learn more about the situation regarding refugees and migrants in our respective countries. And so this afternoon, we will start with short presentations from Kenya and Cameroon. I've also received by email a presentation from Nigeria. I'm not sure if somebody from Nigeria is going to be presenting that, but I assume so. And I'm also then going to call on a few of the other countries that are represented also to give us a brief description. I see a hand raised. I'm going to unmute. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, Michael, sorry, I'm joining late. I've been having challenges with internet connectivity. Yeah. Mark Asobi is my name again. So I shared the situation in Nigeria with you. Great. So maybe hopefully by tomorrow I should be presenting. Is that okay?
That is fine, Mark. If you're able to present this afternoon, that would be even better. We seem to have lost poor connection, but anyway, we will sort that out. So we will run through as many of the countries as we can, but I remind everybody, please, to keep it fairly short. I think I said 15 minutes in the email. Even that may be a little bit too long because we have more countries represented than we expected, even on Friday. So nevertheless, we meet again at 2 p.m. Central African time. So it is now 12 noon Central Africa, in 2 hours' time, we meet again. I know some of you have some difficulty identifying which time zone we're operating on, but you can just think that wherever you are now, in 2 hours' time, you should join us again for the country profiles of this afternoon. There is a comment in the chat box that has come in. I will just read it. It says, perhaps it is important to point out that with advocacy for minorities, such as migrant communities, we should avoid making the mistake of speaking for migrants without giving migrants a voice in addressing their needs. Okay, I think Peter John did cover that a little bit when he had the 3 A's. One of the first A was agency, if I recall correctly.
Yeah.
You want to just say something more about that?
No, I think absolutely agree with that. It's in every term, in every sense, it's a given. I think at several points in the discussion, I mentioned the need to also to enhance people's ability to speak for themselves. You know, we come alongside to supply what assets are not there, and to allow those platforms which we've been able to use to also become available for others. And I mean, and so I have an absolute agreement with that. No question. Total agreement.
Okay, good. So thank you once again for joining us. This has been the first session, a little bit experimental, 1 or 2 little problems, but I think it went fairly well. I want to thank, in particular, for some very hard work behind the scenes, our interpreter, Micheline Muzaneza, who I'm sure is exhausted by now after 2 hours of this. We will be having the services of different interpreters through the course of the week to take the pressure off individual ones. But yeah, let me close this meeting now and invite you all to join us again in 2 hours' time for the country profiles. Thank you very much.
Please sign up for our newsletter at cplo.org.za.